So thanks very much for taking the time to come hear me talk about purple teams. Briefly, here on Friday the 13th. So we'll spend probably the next 40 minutes really just going over what I would consider to be the value of purple teams, right? We'll get into the problem and all that in just a minute. But largely, like I said to Bryson at the top of this, please feel free to ask questions as we're going along, especially if one, things aren't understood, which I expect they would, but two, if you want a little bit of a deeper discussion. Caveats up front, this is the executive track, right? So this is not a technical talk, this is to stay high level. Predominantly, this discussion is around one of the biggest problems that CISOs are challenged with right now, which is how do I prove value of my program, right? If you're a CISO listening, you're either struggling with this now, or you have some solutions, or it's coming down the pipe and you're getting asked on like what the return on investment all is. This talk is like designed around addressing that through immediate, just demonstrating immediate value through purple teams, hence the name of the talk. So appreciate your time being here. So without further ado, I'm gonna jump right in quickly. Again, so this is our agenda for the next 35 minutes. But broadly, we're gonna talk about four things, right? One, sort of, why the big request from executives on security measures, right? This is a big topic. We're not going to solve the topic today, but we're going to discuss that is the problem that we're trying to solve for today, right? Two, the big issue that we all deal with, right, is, well, I have a lot of data. Some of it exists, some of it doesn't exist, and the stuff that does exist is, by definition, almost lagging. Like we'll get into that issue pretty heavily. And then the third is, look, I'm going to provide a point of view on how purple teams help solve that with immediate data, right? And then last, I'll show you an example of how this worked. Now, the names of the client and full output will be obfuscated, but the intent will be there. So if there are any questions, please use the chat. I'm happy to address questions as they come up, or key the mic and we can do it so everybody can hear. All right, so for number one, right, let's just level set real quick on what purple teaming is. I know there's a purple teaming conference. It's probably already clear, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth just level setting. Most of us know what red teams are, right? Offensive team in charge of emulating adversaries, right? Choose what TTPs you want, mimic those tactics or emulate them, right? And walk through the organization to try to pretend like you're that particular threat so that the organization can see, how they do against it, right? Blue team, well, those are the defenders, right? So the individuals, your SOC, your MSSP, if you have one, like the incident responders, those that have to actually try to defend against the organization, right? Are effectively charged with maintaining that security resilience, right? Should be pretty clear, but again, level set. What is a purple team? Well, it's not one particular team, it's the combination of them both, right? This is, some people call it a virtual team, others call it just the merging of red and blue. We should all know this, but I just want to level set because this is a high level discussion for the value of them, right? It's bringing them both together, right? So not to be mistaken with some of the states that are not red or blue, still questionable. That's not the purple we're talking about. So effectively, purple teams. So again, the idea here, of course, is that the blue team is aware of what the red team's activities are so that in real time, remember this is an executive level data discussion, so real time event of what's actually happening, right? So again, the objective, just to be clear, is, as you can see, prove organizational, both your processes, your technologies, and your people, your skills, right, are threat resilient, right? Which means like specific threats, your teams and your tooling and where they're pointed and how they work actually can identify some of the threats that may be part of your threat profile, right? So purple team, level set. So back to the problem. So the issue, as I talked about at the top, is, look, either you're a CISO or you're in the CISO shop, or you're feeding data to the CISO, or you're an executive CEO or board member that just needs to know, like, look, how are we doing in cybersecurity, right? We've basically been at the measures game for a while, right? No one's quite nailed it yet. That's just the issue. There are some of the high-level banks have gotten pretty tight on measures and doing quite well. Some of the other organizations have done well. Most of us struggle with what to actually report to the board, which need to be actionable information, right? Or two, what to report internally so we can take action on them, not only inform risk, right, but also take action on them. And then three, what's just tactical measures that, are fun to pay attention to, but don't really tell us anything. Like, so, how many times we get DDoS? Great. It's interesting from a environmental perspective, right? But it's not necessarily interesting from an action perspective, unless you're, dealing with the DDoS attack, right? Or the variety of DDoS, right? Again, executive level discussion. So broadly, that is all to say that the situation is like security knowledge boards are increasing, right? And they're asking for more data, which means, the days of, hey, I have a program and it's working, feel like they're pretty much long gone. Now it's more of, hey, I have a program, CISO mentions I have a program, and the board says, all right, well, how much did we spend on it, right? And how can we quantify very specific outcomes to those particular tools or the training or even the services we provide, right? Pen testing, red teaming, others, right? So this is the problem, right? So now what does that do for the CISO, right? Or CRO, or I use CISO interchangeably here with, well, not interchangeably, but as an example of somebody who's struggling with this. This doesn't always fit in the CISO shop, but it typically does. So that's why I choose the CISO shop. So the problem, right, is that most data, as we know, is lagging. Now, there's two things to think about here, right, as you're digesting what's on the slide, right? One is, what do I measure? I can measure a lot of things, right? But can I measure something that actually makes sense, right? So what we've seen organizations do is kind of structure that question into, okay, what are some key management areas, things where, okay, I can manage this particular threat or instance or whatever the case might be, right? What are some key performance areas? These are the KPIs, right? How am I doing against specific incidents, or how am I doing to keep my risk level low, right? Then, okay, well, what are those key risk areas, right? Okay, then how am I doing from resourcing? How do I resource all this, right? So what to measure is where the challenge does sit, but the primary challenge, sort of subordinate underneath that, right, is effectively, okay, well, how do I get actionable data here, right? So on the other side of the slide here, you see some current practices, and these, quite frankly, are good. Let's walk through a couple of them, right? So the one that we all seem to love is, the management gaps, right? Time from a discovered threat to the response team activity, right? It's a very telling measure, right? I wouldn't even call it a metric. It's literally a measure. It's the delta of time, right? Time when it was discovered to the time when we actually addressed it, right? We didn't say mitigation. That's different. We all know that. But the point is, timestamp number one, you see it happening. Sorry, timestamp number one, it's happening. Timestamp number two, you see it happening. A lot can happen in that time frame. And this is why we love this measure so much, because it's like, okay, from the moment either an actual threat or a red team is on our networks and may possibly, gaining persistence or moving laterally or whatever the tactic or technique that they're using that we're supposed to catch as a blue team is doing, we need visibility of it right away so that we can start to address it, right? Addressing, as we all know, is a whole different story, right? Do I want to watch them, right? Do I want to get them off the network right away? That's a whole different strategic scope and, quite frankly, a whole different talk. But the reality is, like, we're still struggling with, like, just getting that time from when it actually happened to what we can do. So why do I spend so much time on this? Well, it's still a lagging indicator, right? It's a great measure, right? A lot of companies have a hard time with that particular one. Usually it shows up, pardon me, when you're doing the forensic research of an incident, right? Oh, well, we found out it actually happened here. We didn't have actually visibility in the SOC or SIM, whatever the case might be here, and our team didn't respond to it until here. Okay, with that time span, if it's a day, is an awful long time for your adversary to be sitting on your, well, have access, right? Either be sitting on your network or have access to a file share or a data store or just an endpoint, whatever the case might be, that might actually be able to give them access to critical data, right? Or create some sort of impact to the organization. So the hard part here is getting real-time data, right? How do I actually squish this up to say, I need to see it when I need to know when it's happening, whether my tooling or my team or anybody can identify that's actually happening. I need to know. We'll get to that in a minute. So again, a good indicator here, right? But again, it's lagging, right? And some KPIs, right, that are actually pretty good. Okay, so now time to mitigate a critical threat once it's detected. Now that's a longer time frame, right? Okay, now we've decided to actually mitigate it. How long does that take us, right? That's really where most of the impact comes into, which is why we want to increase performance in that area. This shouldn't be a surprise to many CISOs out there, but that's really the area, that and the time to address and a time to identify and address it, and then address it to mitigation are really the two big keys that we see happening just practice-wise, right, across the board. Again, a good measure, but two things there. It's lagging, and it's actually hard to keep current. One of the big ones here, like number of applications have a security assessment. Why is that important? Well, if you have a big SDLC shop or your big application shop, right, and you're pushing out a bunch of applications, we see quite often that not every single one of them actually, especially with a big push to cloud, not every one of them especially goes through an application review, which is a challenge. So that becomes really hard to keep current because your SDLC process, especially in cloud instances, is outstripping your pace to actually put some security controls in place, right? So, not only can you not, does that interfere with your architecture, right? Because you don't have visibility of it. It also interferes with your logging capabilities to determine, are you detecting it? So, we all love the cloud, but sometimes it's kind of like, opening a magical door to a server or a network that just wasn't there a few minutes ago, right? So again, critical practice, right? Is trying to identify what's happening, get the information, get it quickly enough to take action on it, right? So it's a challenge, right? It's still good, quite frankly, in many places, it's best practice, but it's not real time, right? Or near real time, right? So a couple more, and then I'm going to move on to what we can do about it. So the other area, of course, is key risk indicators. This is what we're, broadly what executives are looking for, as most CISOs and risk managers will tell you, right? I need to understand what's manageable, right? Some good ones there, of course, are number of third-party vendors with access to sensitive data. Can everybody say they can do that? Because usually if you're small enough and you have it written in your contracts, you can, right? If you're large enough, and maybe even an organization with a lot of mergers, acquisitions, should be branch outs but stayed nested inside the company, right, or organization, it's really difficult to know how many third parties you have and how quickly they can get to your third data, right? The Target example years ago taught us this, right? Again, great information, but also somewhat informative, right, from a risk standpoint, but lagging, right? Because it's got to take time to go through the contract to get to the IT department and say, okay, let me authenticate these individuals and track them from an IAM perspective, or better yet, like deprovision them when they're gone, right? These are all things that need to be tracked and maintained over time. So again, back to the problem. The executives are asking for data to prove what the actual outcomes are. And we're struggling inside the organization to not only get the data, but get it in near real time, right? Last one, which is a good one that we see quite a bit, just for sake of argument here, is number of SLAs out of compliance because of incident. Well, if you're a SaaS shop, or you're a shop or you're an organization that is providing a service and you have an outage, and that 99 point however many nines uptime matters, you're out of compliance or out of service, which has massive impact on the company, right? Of course, right? Fines, loss of revenue, whatever the case might be, right? These are issues that that, quite frankly, like executives care about, and as a security shop, you care about, because that's the underlying piece to keep the business running, right? Also a good measure, but again, lagging. So what's the point of this whole thing? Executives are asking for lots of data to prove the effectiveness and efficiency of systems. There's a amount of money that gets spent there, right? Which now they're turning to say, all right, what's the value of everything I've spent, right? Most of the indicators that we have, or the data that we have now, it is good, right? But it's also lagging. So how do we solve for this? Well, of course, naturally, one way to do that is purple teaming, right? This is a slight variation of the real purple teaming term, which matters. But I want to say, for those, I kind of want to explain it this way for those that haven't run purple teams yet. It might be moving in this direction, right? One way to actually, one way to do this, or one way to think about it, is literally you're combining both of them. There's a key element, though, is that the red team does need to communicate immediately with the blue team, and everybody needs on the same page. That is, that's effectively where the real value is going to come in. So, why does this matter, right? I want you to sit back for a second. Think about all the measures we just talked about. They're up on the screen, right? Most of our indicators that we talked about, actually all of them, were lagging. They're lagging indicators, right? Naturally, right? We have to go back and see, okay, when did the incident happen? How quickly do we have visibility of it? The beauty of running a purple team is that you get that information right away, because you literally get the information from the attacker right away, like, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Do you have visibility of it? And that starts to speak value right away, because you can see, okay, how effective are my tools? Are my tools pointing in the right direction? Heck, sometimes, like, did I even turn them on properly? Like, I laugh, but the reality is, like, how many times do we see organizations that, like, have a great tool, it just may not have been implemented properly, or putting the environment in the right direction, right? It's not uncommon. And so, now you get a system, you get an opportunity to say, all right, let's actually test how good is my team. I know I put them through a ton of training last year, especially now during COVID. Well, we've got varying issues, right, with budgets and training, especially when we have this wholesale move to an online environment, which I imagine, can't see everybody, but I imagine, like, our resources have been gobbled up doing a lot of IT issues, moving things wholesale online than what we would like. So training may or may not have taken a hit in your organization this year. But again, you want to test it and see how good was it? Like, if I put somebody through some incident response training, like how well does that apply to my actual situation, right? My actual environment. Purple teaming is one way to do that. So just to run through a couple things that you're looking at here on the slide are, right? So let's get back to some of the ones we talked about earlier, right? Time to discover the threat into, team responsibility, into the team activity, right? You know that because you get that first stamp right away. Okay, red team, we're in. Hey, we spearfished this particular employee. We've gained access. They clicked on it. We've gained access. Okay, blue team, did you see the payload? Right? And how quickly did you identify it? Right? You know that immediate timestamp, right? Not only the T minus at that point, T plus the time the clock's ticking, you can see it. If it takes you 2 hours to see it, and you now know that for that particular TTP, right, for that particular threat actor, what you're actually doing, you don't have visibility for 2 hours. Well, we all know how much you can do in 2 hours. You can do quite a bit, right? So, I mean, effectively, right, without tripping other issues, but that's part of the red team plan, right? So you can see 2 immediate indicators with immediate turnaround. We talked about number 1, right? But 2, like, how many employees are demonstrating poor behavior, right? Well, I know one of them, if they clicked on them. How many others did, right? Now, what does that tell you? Right? That tells you some remedial training, or well, you got to see what happens next. But immediately it starts putting on the radar scope, like, okay, now I know how effective either my phishing campaigns have been. I need to target them towards these type of attacks, depending on, what the spear phishing email actually was, right? So Next, as you think about the attacker moving, gaining persistence and moving through the environment, right? You start to move into a little bit more of the measures that you'll start to get immediate value on, which tell you a little bit more of the story, right? So the performance indicators, like how quickly the incident handler is happening, right? Or sorry, identifying the issue and starting to mitigate it, should that be part of the plan. So during a purple team, you have the red team saying, this is what we're doing. I've gained access to this particular file share based on what I told you I was going to do, and I'm here. How quickly was it identified, and how quickly did it get to the response team, right? In real time. Now, granted, let's be honest, during an exercise, you do have a little bit more of an advantage, right? Because you know it's coming, but it does give you a real-time indicator of say, all right, well, it took me 45 minutes to mitigate this. Or quite frankly, like based on the TTPs, they cut access to the file share. I couldn't get it. The attacker maintained control over it the entire time, and I had no way to get to it, right? So now you went from 45 minutes to a handful of, hours, days, depends, right? Pardon me. So you start to see the point here. While you're watching the exercise unfold, you're getting this real-time data that you can collect and prove, pardon me, the effectiveness of what you're trying to test for, right? Two more that are quite interesting, the last two on the slide, are, this gets to our third-party question. Effectively, a decent number of, depends on your threat intelligence, right, and what your actually attack environment looks like, or your threat environment looks like. But depending on the attack, a significant number will come through a third party with access to your data, right? Assuming that they're not a vendor that may be as security savvy or mature or resilient as you would expect them to have access. So this gets to the question of, okay, now you get real-time data based on the third parties you might want to test that are part of the exercise, right? Always get a permission to test. Again, purple team, everybody knows what's going on before anything happens. The big thing here is to test, with third parties, like, okay, well, did we have visibility when this particular vendor who has access to this without, as themselves, right? Can we attack? Can we figure out when they actually jump in and actually take over an administrator, right? Do we have visibility, right? Again, simplistic terms, not a tech talk, right? We're talking about the broader concepts here. So was that account monitored, right? If it was, what happened, right? The last one, service level agreements, we talked before about, if this is a primary driver for your business, having a loss of not being able to service your customers is going to have an immediate impact on it. So you're able to test this too, depending on, the threats that may come in, and, for a number of them that actually will sit and shut down some of your environment simply for malicious purposes, or for slightly more nefarious purposes, but that depends on the threats that you're actually looking for. So the larger point for all of this, obviously, is running a purple team at this point in time really can give you some immediate insights into how your systems are actually working, how your tooling is capturing what you think it's capturing, and how well your defenders are actually defending against the specific threats that, fit in your, what you think to be, your threat profile. So this, let's jump from sort of the, okay, this sounds all good. How about an example? So I'll use a couple minutes here to jump into example. So before I jump into this, actually, I don't see anything coming up in the chat. So been watching it. Please, like, if you have questions, especially during this part, please feel free to send them my way. So what does all this mean, right? One of the things that we did a little while ago, won't tell you when, again, no client information here, and I'm not going to explain too much detail. But broadly, what we did was the real challenge here, which I didn't write on the slide here, is the CISO said, look, I want to do this. Like, I actually want to test, like, how good am I tooling? How good am my team? Like, we had done an assessment and proven what could happen. The big question came up to say, well, how do we know it's actually going to happen? So they were open to running a purple team, right? And we actually were able to cover 2 different SOCs, right? They're global follow the sun type model. So as one was kicking over to the other, we picked a 3-hour time frame for 1.5 on one, I'll tell you which one. And then when we switched over to the other one, right, we can continue. Both knew what was happening. This one prior to coming in, this one prior to ending their day, right? So again, it was effectively over 2 sets of blue teams. We did that simply to optimize for performance, right? Because, very similar to any programs that you put together, right? You want to make sure that they're working somewhat seamlessly. And so the CISO in this particular case wanted to do that. So what does all this mean? So here's what we did. So with the red team was very clear on the objectives. They had 11 adversarial campaigns for specific threats, right? Classic red team, right? They're emulated TTPs of the known threats that we had specified, and shared their step-by-step activities with full communication over this 3-hour period. Again, 1.5 hours, switch over, 1.5 hours. The threat maintained seamlessly. The SOC was the one that had to deal with the administrative changeover, which, spoiler alert, actually worked out fairly well. Blue team, the CISO wanted to actually monitor this in real time and see it happening. So in this particular example, what we did was we had, what we did was we actually threw up a couple Slack channel and a video in both of the SOCs to, well, one, and then switched over to the other to see what was actually happening. The CISO wanted to record, like, all right, I'm interested in being able to explain why we've invested so heavily in this new, they had a threat hunting team that they wanted to see, like, okay, as soon as it happened, could we find them? So now, again, he wanted to test that. Not your typical blue team exercise, but that was an additional piece for it. And also want to say they'd invested pretty heavily over the last 1.5 years in some very specific tools, right? And then of course training for the SOC and incident response and tier 3 incident responders, right? So what wound up happening over the 3-hour period, as was not necessarily expected, 9 of the campaigns out of the 11 went completely undetected, which was interesting. We didn't necessarily expect it because we had run, there's a couple tools that we ran prior to this, and they were detected during the actual purple team engagement. They went undetected completely. So that includes getting access to domain access. Actually, I have it on slide, 2 undetected attacks, and then right to the critical data. You try to take off the DOP, any cache of data coming off of the network was not within scope. I want to be very clear about that. It wasn't part of this engagement, but we had high degree of confidence that we would be able to do that. So, all right, still not seeing any chat here, so I'm going to keep going. So what does all this mean? Like, all this is to say that after watching this 3-hour engagement, we give the synthesis of like what happened, the specific areas that we were able to gain access to, the specific time between when we had access to when it was detected to when it was actioned to then when, given a critical instance that should have been mitigated, when it was mitigated. That in and of itself gives a tremendously valuable story. The CISO to go back and say, okay, we've spent all this money, right? And largely, given the metrics that we've been showing over the course of, I think, 2 years, right? We're measuring ourselves pretty well. So based on some threat modeling, we saw a handful of threats that we didn't really have scoped into what we think our configuration and our training is going to meet, right, or match. So we picked 11 of them, right, and then we red teamed them with full knowledge of the blue team to see if they could track it. And the way he was able actually to brief the board, he in this case, brief the board to say, look, they had to come in and they got access and we didn't see it. And then they got access and they asked, can you see me? Nope. Here's where I am. Blue team. Nope. No, really, I'm right here. No, can't see it. So then we got really loud, start running a lot of tools, right? Like, okay, well, if we run, I won't say it here, but if we run X tool, like that should get picked up. Still not seeing it. Okay, well, now that we have domain access, let's start running it everywhere. And that's when it got picked up. So that particular time frame, which I'm not sharing here on purpose, was way too long to have domain access, right? And so that in and of itself led to two major product team, to get alerts a little bit more quickly. Two, specific team members, even at level 1, to be able to identify those alerts, all the way to the incident responders to be able to mitigate the issue, respond to the incident, mitigate the issue. And then in this case, a handful of threat hunters to not start with a hypothetical hypothesis of, hey, we think these threats might be here, let's go look for them. Knew they were there, no one could see it, and start seeing where they went after your last indication of compromise. So immediate value from a purple team engagement that really it was really quite refreshing to see a CISO walk away with a sense of what really can happen given an exercise, right? We hear quite a bit, especially from like the site team, like train as you fight. This kind of level, the playing field sort of, all right, let's test as we're fighting. Because very rarely do you get an adversary that's going to say, hey, I'm going to come in and these are the things I'm going to do, right? And you're going to watch it and I want to see, can you actually pick it up, right? Kind of along the way, along the lines of what we used to do in the physical space back in the day, right? This is purple teaming is a way to actually get that immediate feedback to how really good am I against specific threats that, if you do threat modeling, probably are active, if you're a target, right? Assuming the threat is there and you have a vulnerability and, there's an ability to get to the compromise. Purple teams are a good way to assess it. So that is the end of everything. I wanted to save some time at the end here for some questions. I haven't seen any, which either means, well, I don't know what that means. So Bryson, maybe you can help out. But thank you for listening. That's effectively it. And I've run 2 purple teams recently, and quite frankly, like I can't say enough about how valuable they are. But I'll end it there.
But how valuable? What is the purple team?
Yeah.
How? What kind of roadblocks have you met with executives in doing that? Or because I think in at least one of those you were a part of helping them convince to do it, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's not easy because there's 2. Look, let's be honest, like there's 2 things that are really hard for the CISOs or anybody in the security space. One, to admit that, well, that's hard, is to say like, look, my tools may not be perfect, right? I think getting past that is the first hurdle, quite frankly. And then 2, really opening up the aperture of the enterprise and say, look, I trust these people to come in, expose my infrastructure and some of my vulnerabilities to a third party. Like how do I trust that third party that they're going to give me confidence in in giving them this type of access? And then back to number 1, can I actually do this over time repeatably and take this information and get it back to either the board or use it internally, right? And sort of admit that, look, we're not perfect, but we do have vulnerabilities that we need to patch, fix, whatever the case might be, and I want to know what those are right away. So those are kind of the 2 biggest hurdles that I see quite a bit.
Eliza May, if you're on, I think you had a question.
I did, but it's nonsense. I wanted to know, what are the little black dots in the background? Because they look like rock climbing pads, as if you've been like really excited to get upstairs to the point you've been climbing the walls.
Yeah, it's the alternate route, just in case there's water running down the stairs. You know, you need a second route back up, not back down.
That's what I do when I wear suede shoes.
I love it. Yeah, it's actually a rock climbing wall.
It's not.
It is indeed. Yeah, they're actually drilled into the stud, drilled and secured into the studs, so it can support a decent amount of weight. Yeah. Yeah, my daughter. Yeah.
Monkey Man.
He comes over too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like
he's brought the purple teaming process to his stairs. It's cultural, right? Charles talked about this. It's cultural. And so if you include the rock climbing as part of going upstairs to the office to do your day job, that's culture.
Exactly.
That's an overcomplicated culture.
I just totally made it up. So there you go.
Is the change advisory board of stairs?
Well, yeah, what we actually do is, my daughter and I, she'll be on the stairs. Actually, I'll be on the rock climbing wall. She'll be on the stairs. And I'm like, I'm going to move over here. Can you see me? And can you catch me if I fall? She'll be on the stairs and turn around and be like, no, I can't. I can't see you. I'm not going to catch you. And now I know the purple team failed. Yeah, great question. I love it. Yeah, if you're ever in the DC area, you can check it out.
No, don't say that, because I will actually turn up with my harness.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, I actually
I'm
spent.
not good. I'm rubbish.
You know what? It's all about practice. I spent 10 days out in the Mojave, just climbing for 10 days. It was like beautiful. It was pre-COVID, obviously. But also, what you don't see is once you do the wall, there's a wet bar right there.
Oh, so there's an incentive.
That's it.
After you complete your purple team exercise, you have to celebrate with the team so that everybody is a part of that culture of success.
Yeah, in fact,
God.
The going in measure, see, tying it back to the talk, is how quickly can I get up the wall to get the best whiskey, or also, yeah, I'd go with the whiskey. Yeah. And how many shots can I do before the next person gets up the wall? Those are good. Talk about measures. Those are good measures.
And how far can I get up the wall when I've done all the shots?
Yes, I gotta go back down.
Do it all again.
Increasing the sophistication of the threat.
You're Oprah Winfreying the whole thing, Bryson.
Buy my book.
It's all about the journey.
Ryan, thank you very much for sharing this, and your slides will be available on Discord, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the question. Thanks, Bryson.
Next up, we have Sunil Yu with how to use the purple team to point stakeholders to defensible infrastructure. I feel like your whole talk was in the length of that title.
I tried to shorten it, but yes, I as you see, I failed. So
you have presentation rights, so you should be able to throw up your presentation. For those of you who don't know Sunil, if you've heard any of my talks or any time about anything I do, I talk about the smartest person in cybersecurity. That's this guy.
And I always usually say that Bryson doesn't know enough people.
Also true.
But anyway, I appreciate the intro. So I'm Sunil Yu, and I'm currently the CISO in residence at YL Ventures, and formerly the Chief Security Scientist at Bank of America. And today I'm going to share with you some perspectives I've had in actually running essentially what would be a purple team at Bank of America. So the role that I had as the Chief Security Scientist, you may wonder, like, what does a Chief Security Scientist do? Well, my general mandate was to drive perspectives and actions and technologies on, like, what is to be able to be ready for the next generation of threats, next generation of attacks, and to be able to have the right set of technologies and processes in place to be able to tackle those. And as a part of that, I actually had the opportunity to run the red team, the hunt team, and an R&D team. And to kind of provide some perspectives of how I look at the combination of these three teams, you essentially have the red team that's trying to get around all your different controls. You have the hunt team that's trying to find the red team. And then you have the R&D team that's basically trying to get bigger magnifying glasses and ways to close that hole in the wall, as well as to make taller walls, as well as to fill in the holes that you see on the ground. So the combination of those different teams, in some respects, was a progenitor, if you will, to I think what we currently call the purple team. We didn't call it the purple team back then, but it's essentially it brought these different disciplines together. And what I did when I ran these different teams, I basically had them counterbalanced against each other. I created these metrics and these different goals for each team to be able to play off of each other. And so you see some of them here. Ryan's talk goes into much greater detail in terms of the different measurements and metrics that we can use. But in essence, for what I did, I basically said, look, the red team, your goal is to have the greatest dwell time in the world, the largest dwell time, and to be able to get in and go, or get back in as quickly as possible. The hunt team, of course, would be trying to find them, but more importantly, we want to operationalize the detections that they find, so that it's not just the hunt team that finds it, but also the blue team. So I didn't actually run the blue team. I ran what essentially fed the blue team the different detections that they should be incorporating into the infrastructure that we have. And then the R&D team, we tried to find the right countermeasures that prevented the red team from even getting in, and making sure that the hunt team had the right set of tools. Well, as I tried to work to improve our measurements here, for example, like lowering the dwell time or lengthening the time for reentry, what I discovered was that they all pointed me to something about what makes systems and infrastructure more defensible. And it's not what you might think. It's not what you might expect, okay? What you might expect is what is sort of represented here. So there's a lot of countermeasures that we can put forth. And to understand what countermeasures that might be needed, I created this framework called the Cyber Defense Matrix. It's one of the things that we want to avoid in security is a silent failure. But how do we know where a silent failure might occur? I mean, do we know what the attack space is? The Cyber Defense Matrix is something that I created to help me understand this attack space. It's basically a simple matrix that consists of two dimensions: the things that we care about, devices, apps, networks, data, and users, and the things that we do, and it's basically the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so this matrix helps me understand the attack space to be able to avoid silent failures, meaning if an attacker is able to attack one of these areas, then let's make sure that I have a control there to be able to address that. Now, I can fill this with a bunch of countermeasures and hunting tools, but does that really make a difference? Okay, does this actually move us towards defensible infrastructure? Because I think that's how I came in thinking that, sure, I put in all these things and that makes my infrastructure more defensible. But I've come to realize that there might be a better way to think about how we move towards defensible infrastructure. And as a way to think about it, I want to point to another model that my friend Josh Corman presented a while back. And he calls it the survival guide pyramid. And he gave this analogy around how we survive in a zombie attack. Okay, so if you want to survive in a zombie attack, you want to choose defensible infrastructure. You want to, so if you have a structure that you can run to that's more fortified, then you want the defensible infrastructure. You want to have IT operational excellence. You want to make sure that the teammates that you have, you're asking if you're in the midst of a zombie attack, you want to know that if your teammates are going to get you killed, or if you're going to be able to survive the night with your teammates. So that's what you want to have with operational discipline. You want to also make sure that you know what you have, know what changes. You want to have good operational hygiene. You don't want any unplanned changes. These are all things that are what we see in good IT operational disciplines. Next, you want situational awareness. You don't want to be fighting in the dark. You need light, you need visibility, you need to be able to hear these whispers, you need to be able to have a good understanding of what your environment is. So before you buy countermeasures, you want more visibility. You want to see stuff sooner and be able to act more promptly. And then lastly, in that context, now you look for countermeasures, okay? Now, the alternative approach is basically like an inverted pyramid. You build on indefensible infrastructure, and that requires more operational discipline. And usually what we get instead of operational discipline is we get operational confusion. We don't know what's going on. Changes happen and we have no idea what change happened and who did it. Indefensible infrastructure also requires more situational awareness, but oftentimes, again, we're left with situational blindness. And all this requires a lot more countermeasures. And this becomes very expensive and very prone to failure. So there's this concept that we have, again, with a zombie attack. If you're under a zombie attack, then you want to head towards defensible infrastructure. Now, again, when we hear that, we oftentimes think, okay, well, we want these fortified buildings, right? So imagine, go back to the old tale of the three little pigs. You want to choose a straw house, a wood house, or a brick house, or this fortress. And of course, we want to pick the fortress. But is that what defensible infrastructure is? Okay, I mean, sure, maybe in a zombie attack, in a physical world sort of thing, yes, I would like to have a fortress. But in the IT environments that we live in, is the fortress mentality the right mentality that we need to think through? And so I wanted to offer a different analogy to think about what is defensible, okay? And so we have the three little pigs and the fortress mentality, which we know tends to lend itself towards this perimeter concept and those sort of things. And we've been burned by that many times. So let me offer a slightly different analogy, and it's one that involves pets and cattle. All right, so pets and cattle. What's the difference between those two? So pets, those are things that you give it a familiar name. When it gets sick, you take it to the vet, and you like giving it hugs. So this is how we build systems, or how we've been building systems for a while. And these will look like your laptop, your personal laptop. These will be things like your social security number. And when it comes to traditional systems that are built in the traditional way, when it needs a patch, you, again, tend to it, you patch it, you fix it whenever it gets sick. Cattle, on the other hand, are things that you can't even pronounce the name of it because it's full of a bunch of different symbols and letters and characters. And when it gets sick, you just basically shoot it and you move on. And these are things like Docker containers and Lambda functions and credit card numbers that continuously change. Now, when it comes to this paradigm, I think it's important to be able to recognize the distinction between pets and cattle, especially as we think about what we do in risk management, because if we consider the risk management equation, the traditional risk management equation, we look at it as this product of likelihood and impact. But the problem is that when it comes to the likelihood side of the equation, we have a never-ending set of vulnerabilities that get worse over time. And we have this never-ending set of threats that only get better over time. So vulnerabilities get worse over time. Vulnerabilities age like milk. Threats get better over time. Threats age like wine. And the combination of those two is causing likelihood to go up. So the one thing that's really within our control is impact. And what we need to be able to do to reduce risk is to be able to drive impact down. And so the perspective here is a lot of what we consider to be defensible infrastructure and the tools and the capabilities that we put forth to defend our infrastructure is really to try to drive likelihood down. And that's over the long term, that may be a pretty difficult proposition. So what can we do then to look at the impact and to drive that down? And so with respect to that, I propose a new way to think about defensible infrastructure. And I would offer a different perspective called the DIE triad. So the DIE triad, DIE stands for distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And when it comes to each of these different attributes, they confer various security benefits. So if it's distributed, it's resistant to any sort of DDoS attack. If it's immutable, it's easier to find changes, especially unauthorized changes. If it's ephemeral, it's really hard to maintain attacker persistence. So what I found was that when I considered the metrics for the purple team, sure, I wanted to be able to increase our ability to find or to shorten the amount of time it took us to find an attacker, and I can buy a bunch of hunting tools and whatever else it might be. Or I wanted to be able to make attacker persistence hard, so I try to find all these points of persistence and boot them out and so on and so forth. But I realized there might be actually a different way to tackle this problem. So I can put in, again, a bunch of countermeasures, and those countermeasures are oftentimes what we see as the CIA triad, or I can build towards DIE and not need as many countermeasures. Okay, so if I build towards the DIE triad, then I don't have to worry as much about the CIA triad. The perspective here is that they offset effectively each other. And if I build towards ephemerality, then I have a lesser burden or lesser need for confidentiality. If I build something that's more immutable, then I have a lesser need for integrity. If I build something to be distributed, then I have lesser needs for the availability of a given component. But more importantly, for the purple team, it actually helped me drive my metrics towards the direction I wanted, but without having to do more CIA. Okay, which was, I thought, really interesting, because we come in with, as a security professional, thinking, hey, we need to do more security stuff. We need to put in more countermeasures. But if we build towards more defensible infrastructure, but the type of defensible infrastructure that you see here, then our job actually becomes easier. And so when we look at CIA versus DIE, it's important to recognize that when it comes to our pets, we have to CIA them, okay? But when it comes to cattle, we can let them DIE. We build them to DIE. And when it comes to the attacks that we see, or when we have the red team come in and attack your pets, all right, well, you're gonna need a lot of countermeasures for those pets. And that may not be something that you can really avoid, because once you have a pet, yes, you are obligated to protect that pet. But cattle, on the other hand, who cares? Let the red team at it, let them take it over. I was gonna blow it away anyway. And so it's a different sort of perspective of how we think about the problem space. And when we look at it from that sort of perspective, we also have a different perspective of what our role might be within security. So if you're a veterinarian, well, generally you want people to have more pets, because that's going to be more lucrative for you. But consider how our goals may change if our goal is to actually try to reduce the number of pets, and we want to discourage or disincentivize pet creation. In fact, we not only want to disincentivize it, but we want to get people to actively reduce the number of pets they have today. Okay. Now, getting rid of pets are hard. Once you have a pet, you kind of want the pet to live forever, which, you know, if anybody who has a pet, you establish an emotional attachment to it, and then, well, you kind of want that pet to live for a long time. But ultimately, we have to decommission them at some point, get rid of them at some point. And so there's different ways that we can drive towards that. But we could also exercise better control as to what pets are created to begin with. And so anything that violates the principles of the DIE triad, we would then try to put in safeguards and controls that minimize the conversion of cattle into pets. Keeping in mind that one of the attributes of DIE is ephemerality. So if you do nothing, okay, if you do nothing, then you're starting to violate the principle of ephemerality, meaning this cattle that you built, if you do nothing, it will continue to live longer and longer. And at some point, it starts looking more and more like a pet. If you start modifying that cattle in place, if you even patch it in place, all right, it's starting to become more and more like a pet. And so what we want to think about is what kind of controls can we put in that let people know you're about to adopt a pet. And if you're willing to sign up to give this pet a lifetime of love, care, and attention, all right, more power to you, but just know that you're now obligated to take care of this pet forever. And if it runs out into the street, if it goes out into the street and it gets run over by a car, then the SPCA or the CCPA is going to come after you. So, just putting you on notice that that's what's going to happen. But like I said, it changes our role from being just strictly a veterinarian to also being a pet control officer. And so as we think about where we're heading with respect to building or encouraging people to go towards more defensible infrastructure, it's getting people to build more cattle, but also preventing them from, or at least warning them before they start adopting more and more pets. And these are things that are actually very measurable as well. And so when it comes to using the purple team to drive people towards defensible infrastructure, we can see those statistics in terms of, at least I was able to see statistics in terms of their ability to maintain persistence in certain environments when those environments went away pretty quickly, right? And so one of the measurements that we can put forth here is this notion of, so if I use ephemerality as a metric, as a measurement, okay, I can do something like look at the uptime of all my systems and then determine which systems I have that are more pet-like and which systems I have that are more cattle-like. Those systems that have a longer lifetime tend to be more pet-like, and those that have a very short lifetime tend to be more cattle-like. I want if I'm going to try to drive my stakeholders towards having more cattle, then I want them to recognize that the red team attacking the cattle, and at the end of the day, it has very little impact, whereas the red team attacking pets have a lot of impact. Now, you may wonder, okay, well, what's a pet, what's a cattle here? And we can set an arbitrary time frame, just say, let's say 40 days, okay? And anything older than 40 days is a pet, anything younger than 40 days is cattle. And say, okay, we only have 500 pets, that's great. Well, maybe, it's great. 2.5% of our environment is pets. And if my team's large enough, we have enough vets for these pets that we have, all right? But I may not be comfortable 40 days. I mean, if you think about attacker persistence, 40 days is quite a long time to be able to have a lot of damage. So let's suppose I want to drive that down to 10 days, all right? But now I have 2,000 pets, and I don't have enough people to manage those pets or to be able to secure those pets. So let me now set new goals that push for fewer pets and shorter lived cattle. Let's set a target that says, look, let's try to keep, make sure that nothing becomes a pet without us knowing about it after 10 days. And let's try to get the number of pets down to something more manageable. And so again, this is another way to think about how we can represent, try to drive towards defensible infrastructure here. Now, you may also wonder, like, what do we mean by defensible infrastructure that aligns with DIE? And so I wanted to offer some thoughts there too, in terms of capabilities that we see that enable us to actually build towards DIE. And the cloud native world, or just infrastructure as a service providers, really already align heavily towards DIE. If you think about the cattle notion, the notion of cattle, pets and cattle actually came about when people were trying to describe how we should build things in the cloud. And so I have this adage that I say, which is pets on-prem, cattle in the cloud. If you're putting cattle in the cloud, that's exactly where it should go. If you're going to put a pet in the cloud, just take the necessary precautions so that you don't have that pet unprotected in the cloud. Okay, and it requires different types of protections, but know that you still need to CIA that pet, and CIAing that pet in the wild, out in the cloud, where it could potentially be very hazardous to that pet. If you're doing that not without the proper precautions, then that pet's going to get run over pretty badly. But cattle, on the other hand, you don't care. You build towards DIE for the cattle, and that's exactly how it should be built. And if that cattle gets run over or gets sick, again, you shoot it and you move on. And whether you're using AWS capabilities or there's a whole bunch of things within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, lots of different tools, lots of different capabilities out there that will help you build towards DIE. All right, so the other perspective then to offer is, again, let's go back to the Purple team. What can I do to be able to share with my stakeholders to say, let's build towards defensible infrastructure. Let's find ways where we can use the metrics from the Purple team to, again, nudge people there. And I think I came up with this as a result of Bryce and our conversations around constraining the attacker space. I think I still have some minor divergences from how you think about it, but nonetheless, this perspective of how do we constrain the attacker space, right? But how do we actually even show that? I want to be able to show that here, right? Because I want people to see that, okay, we have, you can take the CrowdStrike report and show, according to CrowdStrike, we have all these different APTs attacking, being represented in the matrix here and saying, here's where all these attacks are emerging. And if you're going to build something using traditional web architectures, you have all this attack surface. But if you're going to build it using a serverless function, we've now eliminated significant parts of the attack surface. That is why we want you to go towards something like this, more defensible infrastructure. Bryson, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, so this came around the concept that I had that I first put out at a ShmooCon Fire Talk about, going on 3 years ago, about the fact that the way that an attacker is constrained is that once they're in the post-access environment, so they pop shell, they're there, is that the code that they put down goes along 2 axes. It has to communicate and it's going to do things. So communications and capabilities. And communications is an inherently limited function because I'm constrained to the protocols that are in your environment, and there's only so many computer protocols, period. So that's a finite access. And then if we look at what they do is also going to be along a predictable line of an attack chain. Now, the challenge here starts to get into, if we're going into the market of, does it matter that I can turn that into a checklist, or does it matter if it's state-based? And so my hypothesis is that the attack chain across those axes has to be state-based, but it's a hypothesis. There's not been enough data along this research for anybody to definitively make that statement other than to conceptually argue it.
Well, so it's interesting you point that out, because one of the key attributes of this notion of DIE is that many of the assets that we see in DIE are actually stateless, right? And the more that you build off of stateless components, again, the harder it is for an attacker to attack it. And so again, it provides another way to constrain what the attacker, what you're exposing to the attacker as well.
Yeah, and that's what I like about your model, is it's the CISO's perspective of how do I look at my architecture and put it into these categories that help me prioritize and build natural processes for the defense of them.
That's right. And ultimately, again, moving towards what I would label as defensible architecture, or defensible infrastructure, but not defensible because you've put all these countermeasures on, but because you've picked the components that are, in my view, DIE-like. Now, defensible infrastructure is just part of it. I mentioned earlier that we also need to be able to pay attention to operational discipline and situational awareness. And so when it comes to operational discipline, one of the things that we want to be able to test in our red team is more than just popping a box. I mean, we've been there, done that. And frankly, there are a bunch of tools that can help us do that. And so I was thinking about, how do I really differentiate what the red team is supposed to do relative to all these other things that we see in the marketplace? And I run the danger of pigeonholing or marginalizing the red team here. Hopefully, or I run the danger of marginalizing a group of people who are sophisticated enough to go and attack me. But hopefully this will make sense. So when I think about the different activities that we do, what I want to be able to ensure I have operational discipline in is all the different functions associated with identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover across all the different domains that you see. So I need to make sure that I'm exercising operational discipline throughout this entire process. Well, what is it that we test in each of those different cases then? What should I be asking the red team to do? Okay. What should I actually be looking at technology to do on my behalf? And if I am going to have some person do something, then what is it really that I'm asking that person to do? Okay. All right. So I was trying to think through that, and I came to this realization that in each of the different columns, if you will, of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, I'm actually testing something slightly different. So in the first column, we have tools that do vulnerability assessment. But my question is, what is it that we are actually testing? What is the control that we're testing? And I would argue that we're testing essentially configuration controls. Did we misconfigure something? Did we build something that was full of vulnerabilities, which shouldn't be built with vulnerabilities at all? Okay, I mean, controllable vulnerabilities, things that we know. Did we misconfigure it? Did we bake it in with vulnerabilities to begin with? And so the first set of controls would be a vulnerability assessment. Now, sure, I can hire somebody from Project Zero and have them find new vulnerabilities and so on and so forth. But the preponderance of this type of activity is going to be done by technology, where we know what to look for, and we just systematically, continuously look for it to make sure that we don't build systems that are misconfigured or have vulnerabilities that we know of. The next stage is testing then preventative controls. Now, if there are vulnerabilities that emerge, okay, what are we doing to make sure that those vulnerabilities are being addressed or being mitigated? And the whole notion of the way I would look at penetration testing is one of the common complaints that we have is asking for a pen test and just getting a vulnerability assessment, right? Like, that's not what I expected more. Well, what is it more that I'm expecting? I'm expecting to see whether or not that vulnerability is actually exploitable, okay? And that's it. Let's consider that to be the full scope. I don't need for you to go much more past the penetration portion. I just need to know whether or not a particular vulnerability is actually exploitable, okay? Whether or not a mitigation I put in actually mitigates, right? All right, then the next stage is detect. And here, what I'm testing, of course, are detective controls. And the question that I'm asking here is, if I know of a particular vulnerability or an issue that I can't fully protect myself from, at the very least, I want to know when something happens. And in particular, what I want to know is, does it get logged? Does it get logged and triggered such that it eventually appears in some analyst dashboard? Now, before an analyst actually sees it, I'm happy to suppress it because I don't need to necessarily create noise for that analyst, okay? And I think there's a bunch of breach and attack simulation tools that do that activity on a regular basis. And the purpose that I would put for it is really just to test these detective controls. Can I make sure that there's not a silent failure of a detective control, in that it doesn't get alerted or the data doesn't get to the right place and the analysts wouldn't otherwise see it? So that's the test that I want to do here for the detect side. And then last but not least is then the red team. And I put the red team here at the very end to say, okay, well, what is it that fundamentally I'm asking them to do? Am I asking them to pop a box? No. Am I asking them to find the latest ODay? No. What am I really asking them to do? I'm asking them to test our response controls. So in this case, I want an actual event to show up on somebody's dashboard, and I want to know, does the blue team actually respond to it? What do they do, right? And I want to be able to assess that and make sure that across all these different functions that we have operational discipline in how we configure, how we take preventative actions, how we make sure that our data detection engineering and data engineering activities are done right, and that our incident response and incident management processes are all happening properly as well. Okay, so all these processes that undergird our ability to exercise good operational discipline. And I think the red team is, the purple team as a whole, and the red team in particular here, is a key part of making that happen, making sure that we are actually exercising the right set of operational disciplines that undergird all these different processes. So that's operational discipline. And then lastly, situational awareness. We want to make sure that the hunt team has the information that they need to be able to find the activities that the red team would trigger, and that they know with a higher degree of certainty that this is something that is a legitimate issue. It's not a false positive. And so there's a lot of measurements that we can factor in here. Like, is the data there? How far does it go back? Does it answer the question that I have? And the goal here is not necessarily to just get deeper situational awareness in a given domain, but rather focus on getting the broader or more comprehensive view of situational awareness across as many domains as possible. That helps us eliminate false positives more quickly. And again, this is enabled through defensible infrastructure, because the type of systems that I'm talking about that are built to be DIE, they tend to already be well instrumented, because the visibility is actually an inherent part of how we manage and operate those systems. And so you build towards DIE, and we end up being able to support things like situational awareness. And again, it could be coupled with the activities that we do with the purple team to reinforce this notion that you build towards this more defensible infrastructure, and we gain more visibility as a result of that. So in summary, again, we should leverage these purple team metrics to be able to point stakeholders to defensible infrastructure. I would define defensible infrastructure as those things that have the qualities of being distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Now, unfortunately, not everything is defensible, right? And so if you want to find a countermeasure for your pets, or what I would call indefensible infrastructure, then the cyber defense matrix can be useful to help you find those countermeasures. But it gets pretty expensive, right? And so I think that our best countermeasure is to avoid creating pets at all, or try to minimize that as much as possible, and instead promote cattle creation. And so with that, I throw out my statement: death to the CIA. I'm sorry, death to CIA, not the CIA. Death to CIA. Long live DIE.
For the American Intelligence Agency that's listening, that's Sunil Yu.
I said to CIA. Anyway.
We have a question here. Have you done any work on crosswalking this model to practices from different but potentially analogous domains like aviation or medicine or meteorology?
Meteorology, is that what I heard?
Meteorology, just crosswalking this to other domains, and those were examples that were offered.
That's the first time I've ever heard meteorology, but so if you're referring to the DIE Triad, the answer is yes. And the hardest way to think about it is with physical manifestations, but it turns out to be a little easier than you think when we apply the right concepts to it. So let me apply a couple of physical manifestations. DIE versus CIA, okay, or pets versus cattle. Let's take fighter pilots, okay? Fighter pilots are pets, drones are cattle, okay? Let's apply that to energy infrastructure. Nuclear power plants are pets. Localized solar production would be cattle. Now, some of these analogies get a little harder when it comes to, well, actually, so hopefully that makes sense. But one of the common questions I get is, well, what about data? Doesn't data seem like a pet all the time? And the answer is, well, sort of, but there's an interesting movement that's happening within the privacy ecosystem that is driving us that is penalizing people for having data pets and trying to encourage people to instead have data cattle. And ironically, the means by which we do that is through what's called privacy enhancing technologies, which has the acronym PET. But there's a whole bunch of privacy enhancing technologies that essentially allow us to, instead of building more data pets, to actually build data cattle instead. And these are things like secure multi-party computation, federated learning, homomorphic encryption, differential privacy. There's all these different technologies that are emerging right now that will help us do that too. All right, hopefully, I don't know if I answered the question properly, but that was how I would look at it.
Well, Bob didn't ask a follow-up on it, so we'll take that as a yes. I don't know if Ty and Eliza May are on.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I could not find the mute button. That happens when you've had quite a few gins. Fantastic talk.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers.
Is there a question? All right.
All right, everybody, we're going to be heading over to the main track for closing remarks. Sunil, again, I think you continue to hold the banner to the fact that I don't know that many people, and you're the smartest person I know in cybersecurity.
Thanks.
Sunil, we have one more question.
Oh, okay.
Speaking of cows, how do you hire for your steak?
So Josh tells me that your sacred cows make the best hamburgers. And our sacred cows are not pets, right? So pets make the best hamburgers. I like it medium rare. Thank you.
Ah, me too. That was it.
So I have a question. You said your sacred cows make the best hamburgers. Are you intentionally saying hamburger versus steak?
Sure. No. It was a.
Because I thought that was even funnier, right? Like the best, your sacred cows make like the best steak, and it's like, oh, because it's a sacred cow, it's so delicious. But then to like on top of that, like turn it into a burger, which is just ground meat, where you're like, what's the point? That's why I was curious.
Burgers are amazing.
This shows why it's so important to always keep your stakeholders involved.
Ha.
Wink, wink.
Okay. I'll be sure to remember those puns for the next time I deliver this.
Dad unicorn.
All right. Anyway,
right.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, in the executive track, we're heading over to the main track to join George and company. Sunil, good to see you again.